I'm French, and before coming to the US, I was expecting some culture shocks. But seriously, nothing could have prepared me for some of the things I'm about to tell you. Alright, the first one was so shocking to me that when I first saw it, I couldn't stop laughing. Like when you know you shouldn't be laughing, but you feel so uncomfortable that you can't help it. That's what happened to me when I saw those crazy drug commercials with a very long list of intense side effects. I know health is a serious matter, but the side effects are so long and so intense, and also there's a crazy contrast between the gentle music and happy visuals they put on top of them. It becomes so weird and funny to me. In the US, the drug makers have to list all the side effects, and that's not the case in France, where I come from. But seriously, these are so funny to me, and I think I'm not the only one because there's even compilations on YouTube with the best, craziest drug ads. In any case, this top comment from one of the ads for an anti-smoking drugs I've just showed you just sums it best. Anyways, as you can see, this is gonna be a light video about my personal opinion, so let's get into the second thing that really shocked me when I first moved to the US, which is how far Americans are willing to drive. It feels to me that people are always going on crazy road trips. Like, for example, I met a girl who moved from LA to New York by car, which, just to put things into perspective, if you were driving a similar amount of time in Europe, you'd be going from Madrid in Spain to Moscow in Russia, and then crossing through 7 different countries. As a European, this seems like such an insane road trip to me for so many reasons, and obviously one I wouldn't make at the moment in Europe given current events. But in the US, since the country is so massive, it does make sense to drive a lot. Also, driving in the US is pretty fun since there's a lot of natural beauty, and also the landscapes change quite a lot. And now I've been to 15 different US states, and I've also done my fair share of road trips, but I have to admit that it was always as a passenger, because I would get so tired if I had to drive myself. And to be honest, that's why I've loved taking long distance Amtrak trains. Like recently we went from New York to SF by train, and it feels so ideal to me. You get all the nice views without any driving. Alright, but one thing I love about road trips is that you can stop along the way. In particular in diners, which leads me to my next point, which is diner culture and big breakfasts. So, a bit of context here. In France, where I come from, breakfasts are pretty small. Like most days, I usually eat a piece of bread with a bit of butter, maybe a fruit, and if I really want to go crazy and it's the weekend, maybe an almond croissant. So you can probably imagine that I was shocked in such a positive way when I had my first American breakfast. Like, you can order anything you want, either sweet or savory. You can have all types of eggs, omelets, pancakes, hash browns, home fries, and often, if you go to a diner, unlimited coffee refills. And I don't know if you feel this way, but as a European, diners are my favorite type of American restaurants. They feel so cozy and comforting, and I really like the old school vibes and the massive portions. And I like them so much that I've developed a kind of weird fascination with the show Diner, Drive-Ins and Dives. Every time I'm on a road trip, I look at the map with all the locations and I try to hit up a few of them. Also, I have to mention another experience that shocked me during my American road trips. It's American toilets. As a European, I was not prepared for the lack of privacy in American toilets. And apparently that's a very common experience. Like, there's a subcategory of TikToks of Europeans being in shock when they have to go to a public bathroom. And the reason is that there are massive gaps both under the stalls, but also on the sides of the stalls. And I've read that it's to discourage people to use the stalls in unintended ways, but the gaps are so big that you can actually make eye contact with people. And it seems that there's an unspoken rules that you should never look towards the gap, but I first didn't know that. My old work in the US used to have those exact stalls, and I did make eye contact with someone I was working with, which is maybe one of the most embarrassing experiences possible. But anyways, moving on to point number 5, another thing that shocked me positively is how much authentic international food there is. I used to live in New York City, which is, you know, the capital of international food. Like, you can find very authentic Malaysian, Indonesian, Indian food, which makes total sense because the US is a country that's based on immigration, and there's just a lot of people from all over the world that also bring their culture with them, and I find that to be such an amazing thing. Like, you can never get bored in terms of food. There's always a new cuisine to try. And this is not limited to big cities. Like, when we were driving through Texas, we randomly stumbled upon this gas station serving Czech food, and this one was so cool and definitely a favorite among locals. Like, they have a bunch of different different Czech pastries, and apparently there's a big Czech community in Texas. But anyway, something a bit deeper that also shocked me is the cost of education in the US and how much sports play a role in tuition. So I think a lot of Europeans are already aware that education is very expensive in the US. Like, we hear about those crazy stories of people having millions of dollars in student loans or tuition being around 90 grand a year. Also recently there has been a lot of talk around student debt and student loan forgiveness, but it really feels crazy to me how much universities can cost. But if you compare the cost of some colleges to the actual salary you're gonna earn later, it's maybe not always worth it. But also something that I found really crazy is how if you're good at sports, you can get a full scholarship. And that's what happened to my American boyfriend Bobby. He played baseball his whole life. Although I don't understand too much about baseball, he seemed to be pretty good at it because he got a full scholarship for college. And I don't know the exact numbers, but the current cost of a year tuition at the college he studied at is around $50,000. And you know, that's a lot of money to play baseball. I feel very happy to have been born in Europe because I was terrible at sports growing up. And in general, I feel so privileged to not know too much about student loans. So if you want to share your experience in the comments, please go for it. I'd love to read it. Just to give you a bit of perspective on how the French system works, only 10% of French students get student loans. There's a lot of state-owned universities that are very cheap. There's also business schools, which is what I personally did, which are not cheap, but I feel the tuition is more in line with how much you're gonna earn later. And there's even schools that pay you to study. Like, I know a lot of people who did Polytechnique, which is the best French engineering school and also part of the military, and they got paid during their studies. Obviously, this school is so competitive and it's more of an exception, but I feel that in general, education is more accessible in France. But another thing that still doesn't make sense to me is why roaming is so expensive in the US. There's crazy horror stories of people getting phone bills for thousands of dollars after traveling internationally, and to avoid this, you should absolutely check out Airalo. Airalo is a long-term partner of the channel, and they provide instant and affordable data plan through eSIMs in more than 200 countries and regions around the world. An eSIM is a 100% digital solution, which means you don't have to get a physical SIM card. You can just install your eSIM at home and activate it when you arrive to your destination to have data right away, which is so much easier. One thing I really like about them is that they have so many different regional plans that cover several countries. In Europe, their plan includes 42 countries like Switzerland, the UK, or Belgium. I've personally used them for quite a while, and they are my favorite travel hack to have data on my phone everywhere I go and avoid expensive roaming fees. So I recommend you try them too, and click the link in the description to download the Airalo app and use my code Lucille3 for $3 off your next eSIM. Alright, this next one is a bit weird, and it took me a while to notice, but once you see it, you can't unsee it ever again. So I noticed this when my parents came to visit us in New York, and my dad was trying to pay for the cab in cash, and he just gave me his cash and he was like, "Here, pay for me, I just can't see anything." And it's because unless you can clearly see the numbers, US dollar bills kind of all look the same. Like, here are the euro bills to give you a bit of context. They are clearly a different color, so if you forgot your glasses at home, you know that blue is a 20, for example, and they are also a different size, which is great to recognize them if you're blind or visually impaired. With US dollars, it's not always obvious which nut is which, and even though I have perfect eyesight, I have personally made the mistake of giving the wrong bill to people many times, especially in not very well lit bars, because the US is the only country where bills are all the same size and the same color, which is why my dad was having issues when trying to pay the cab because he usually uses glasses to read. And this got me thinking, like, how do you pay in USD with cash if you're blind? Well, apparently you can't, and it's a bit of a big issue because you either need this type of machine or to trust that people are giving you the correct change, which doesn't really seem like a good solution. And dollar bills are not the only confusing thing for me in the US. You guys also have all kinds of weird measurement formats. There's obviously the date format, so in the US you put the month, then the day, then the year. In France it's the opposite, we put the day, then month, then year. This has led to a few mix-ups in my life. There's also the imperial system, which to be honest I'm still having a bit of trouble navigating. But also one thing I love is that kind of anything goes to measure stuff. Blocks for distances, football fields for size. And I love that on this video on the topic, one of the top comments is, "I bought a 5-acre land. No idea how big that is. Then I found out it's approximately 4.5 football fields. worked for me, and I bought it. And to be fully transparent, using football fields and blocks to measure stuff is actually less confusing to me than the imperial system. Another thing I'm having trouble to adapt to is getting carded when buying alcohol. Obviously, now I look well above 21, so people don't card me in restaurants anymore. But like for bars or buying alcohol at the store, I still get carded, and I always forget my ID. In contrast, in France, I feel the only 2 times where you need your ID is when you're going to a nightclub or when you're flying. And speaking of bars and restaurants, another thing that really shocked me is how loud people are. Like, I feel in France we speak at such a lower volume that if I go to a restaurant in the US with a French friend, I will not always hear them because everyone else is yelling but us. And when I was trying to understand why that is, I came across this video from Damon Dominique where he says something that's very interesting. He says that in the US your personal bubble is way bigger and people have never been told to be quiet or to shut up, which is more the case in France. And this is my question to you if you're American. Are you hearing other people fine? Because on my side, when I go to a crowded bar or restaurant, even if I'm yelling, even if the other people are yelling, I still can't hear anything because everyone else is yelling. But in any case, apart from that, the dining experience in the US is so amazing. And a thing that positively surprised me is how convenient it is. Like, first of all, you can customize pretty much anything, which is not always the case in other countries. Then the portion sizes are massive, you often get free refills, and then the service is much more friendly than in Europe. And that's something I had to get used to, but now I really like it, and it overall feels like a more comfortable experience. One thing that did surprise me though is that when you're paying, it looks like this. They take your credit card away, whereas in Europe you would never give your credit card to the waiter to avoid any risk of fraud, and they actually come with a card machine to your table for you to pay. And speaking about credit cards, another thing that shocked me is the cult of credit cards in the US. I've spoken about it before. As a European, I've never had a credit card, only a debit card, and I actually grew up thinking that credit cards were bad, like as in they encourage you to spend money you don't have, which can be dangerous. And I remember the first time I tried to open a bank account in the US, the salesperson actually tried to sell me on a credit card, and this didn't sit right with me. I actually left and opened my bank account in another bank. But obviously since then I've understood that credit cards are kind of necessary in the US. To build credit and have a credit score, you do need one, and a lot of people like them because you can have points and get some perks. Obviously to get these perks you still need to spend some money, so I still don't really like credit cards, but I do understand now why people have them. And if we're speaking about consumption habits, I have to tell you about the next thing that shocked me, which is how much stuff people have. And I feel that's because the homes in the US are so big. Just to give you a sense of scale, the average single family home in the US is 4.5 times bigger than my apartment. And obviously if you have a big house, you tend to have a bit more stuff. Like for example, I came across this house in the suburbs of Chicago on Zillow, and it's the perfect example of what I mean. And granted, it's quite far away in the Chicago suburbs, but from a European perspective, everything seems so big for no reason. Like there's a 3-car garage and a giant basement home gym full of random stuff. And obviously I want to say that this is not a criticism, it's just a cultural difference, you know, which is tied to the American culture of convenience and comfort that is not as present in France where I live. I personally totally understand the appeal. I also dream sometimes of having a home gym and an office instead of working in the living room. But then I also like having a smaller home and not too much stuff because it's cheaper, less stressful, and it takes less time to clean. And I also feel that this kind of reflects a bigger cultural idea of the US, which is a belief in individual effort and responsibility. And that ties up to my next point, which I've called the myth of the self-made man. And that's kind of this very American idea that you're fully responsible for your own success, and that no matter your background, if you work hard enough, you can do great things. And I feel this idea is very strong in the US. That's why we have the Forbes self-made billionaire list, and it's obviously a controversial list. Like Kylie Jenner was on it, and it turned out that she was neither self-made or a billionaire. But in this Forbes list, they added a score to evaluate how much a a person is responsible for their wealth. And I'd love for you to weigh in on that. But from a personal point of view, which I feel is shared quite a lot among other Europeans, success is not only an individual effort, but it's also shaped by all your support systems, like your family, your community, or your education. And there's also obvious factors you can control, like generational wealth, connections, and just, being at the right place at the right time. So this is why this myth has always been surprising to me as a European. But one thing I do like about it, though, is how motivating it can be. Like, it's great to have the feeling that you could technically do anything and not be afraid to take risks and put in the work. I do feel sometimes in France we have a bit of a more fixed mindset, which I'm not always a fan of. And while I still don't believe that being a self-made billionaire is a thing, I realize that there's real power in believing that you can make something happen. And that's all for me today. If you found this interesting, you should go ahead and watch one of the videos that are on screen right now. Go check them out and I'll see you there.